Great, thank you. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and really appreciate you all for being flexible with the rescheduled date, especially for the speakers that I'll be introducing in a bit. But now that we're here, I'm going to talk a little bit about, the goal of this webinar. So the purpose of this webinar is to focus on Palestine and Venezuela's shared history of colonial oppression and external intervention, which creates a strong foundation for mutual solidarity. Of course, both want self-determination and have been suffering as a result of US imperialism. Their mutual solidarity reinforces each other's sovereignty against US and Western powers, and it's crucial for us as socialists in the imperial core to extend that solidarity alongside the international community. Um, so that is the goal of this webinar, and I hope you can take a lot from this and definitely let us know down the line what you've learned, and we'd be happy to hear from you. But before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to welcome Sigil, who is one of the co-chairs of the IC Palestine Subcommittee, to briefly share about the Chevron campaign they've been working on. We'd like to also thank the IC Palestine Subcommittee for co-sponsoring this webinar. So Sigil, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Sigil. My pronouns are she, her. I'm co-chair of IC Palestine, along with Haley S. And yeah, just to tell y'all a bit about IC Palestine first, it's the newest subcommittee of the IC, if you're not aware. Um, if you're doing Palestine work in your chapter, we would love for you to sign up and join IC Palestine. We have a few things in the mix. Right now, the main campaign that we just launched was Chevron, and there are Stop Fueling Genocide campaign, which basically Chevron is using gas profits to participate in ethnically cleansing and occupying Palestine. I believe they're like the largest supplier now of gas to Israel in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Venezuela is also no stranger to this kind of exploitation from the West and from the US. And if I can just say a few words about that, I think the past year, I realized that like it's not just that we extend our solidarity as people in the imperial core. We need to understand there's a lot of brainwashing that was done to us, and we have our disconnect from the global South. So I think the more we listen and learn from Palestinians, Venezuelans, folks in pretty much every other global South country, that's the best way we can be in solidarity. There's a lot we just don't understand, and I think those of us that's why this kind of panel is so important. I'm excited to be doing more and more of these. I'm sending the link to the Chevron campaign in the chat. So if your chapter would like to get involved, please join up. If you don't have Chevron in your area, like if you're on the East Coast, we are in the process of working on a Maersk campaign. And we've also been working on polyed. We're hoping to maybe start doing some labor and anti-imperialism polyed soon, maybe learning about the history of resistance and stuff like that. So if you're interested in any of those things or even more, please join. And yeah, I look forward to working with any and all of you and also listening to this panel. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Sajal. And that's also very important work that the Palestine Subcommittee is doing. So definitely sign up if you would like to get involved. So I just realized I did not introduce myself at the beginning of this webinar. I just got too excited to introduce it. So to those that don't know, I'm Savannah. I use she, they pronouns, and I am a member of the IC along with the Provisional Venezuela Working Group. And obviously, I'm here to moderate this webinar. So there you go. So I would like to introduce the first speaker. So the first speaker that we have is Diego Sequera. So Diego is a journalist, writer, translator, editor, and political analyst based in Caracas, Venezuela. He is a founding member of Misión Verdad, where he currently writes about geopolitics, new warfare, global conflicts, and Latin American and Venezuelan history and politics. So Before I let Diego explain what's going on in Venezuela, what we're going to be doing is we're going to ask a very important question that they will be answering in this webinar, and we will have time for Q&A at the end. So my question to Diego is, can you talk about the past and current solidarity between Venezuela and Palestine, its importance and Zionist ties to right-wing forces in Venezuela?
Sure, sure. Thank you very much. Well, hi everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me, and also very thankful for your will to listen and share and just have a nice exchange of things. And I also have to thank you because of your interest in Venezuela, but also, of course, obviously in Palestine. And yeah, I think it's quite important. So also I have to apologize because, well, the setting is not the best. And also, if I get slow, just bear with me a bit. I'm just a bit tired. Anyways, yes, there are many things, and it's already a long recent history, I might say, of the Venezuelan and Palestinian relationship. There's even a longer strand of this that goes pretty far even to the Ottoman years, with Ottoman migration into Venezuela. There were actually Levantines, as in Lebanese or Syrians or Palestinians. But that's, another level of conversation. But it's also a background. I mean, Arab cultures, especially Levantine cultures, are no strangers to Venezuela, ever. So it's also ingrained in the Venezuelan fabric in many ways. You can find, different backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different ethnicity, and so forth throughout the whole 20th century. But anyway, fast forward to where we are right now and the years previous to that, and I think we can talk about three layers of engagement between the Palestinian cause, the Palestinians themselves, and Venezuela, and especially Bolivarian Venezuela, of course. First of all, you can think about, there's a major institutional and political framework that has been developed throughout the years on foreign policy, but also on more institutional levels of exchange and also commitment with the cause. I'm going starting from students that come here to study some areas, especially medicine, but also on a higher level, as in government engagement, state to state engagement with the Palestinian state, as it has been recognized by Venezuela a long time ago. Also, mind you, Venezuela also broke diplomatic relations with the state of Israel back in 2009. And they haven't been, reinstated ever since. So this also shows you a very important community. If you assess a bit how the consequences of this decision can have in foreign policy, diplomacy, and in the other areas, although it doesn't translate itself, because also besides all these Arab origin Levantines, there was also a Jewish community here all the time. But of course, and it's not a strained relationship between the government and the Jewish community, although there have been attempts to, you can think of creating situations that false flaggy-ish, that could, you can set the blame on the government. Small things like graffitis and dumb things that they try to, that have seemed, they actually seem pretty astroturf, and it hasn't happened in a long time, although, anyway. So why this is also important in this level, mind you, that in a way that since, 2009 onwards, it also became so ingrained that it's also a national cause in a way. Right now, if you go to any of the state institutions, you're going to find places where you can donate things that are going to be eventually sent to Gaza through Egypt. So that involves like many levels of engagement, as in society people that are not necessarily politically organized or involved in politics, but are sensitive to the issue, to people that are, of course, are more politicized and also involved in many levels. It's sad that Hindu Anderi wasn't able to join because she has an authority on this matter because she has been organized on the, let's call it, the civil society area with one of the oldest Palestinian solidarity foundations, the Fundación Canaán, and she's been talking about this for a very long time. In the same way, this also, like, given myself not someone who represents the government in any way, but supports it. I mean, but I can also talk like easier about some things. I mean, sometimes you can find uncomfortable, at least at some level, it's the kind of formal relationship the Venezuelan government has with the Palestinian state, asking who is their counterparts and who are the legal representatives of the Palestinian states, and you get like mixed feelings when you think about Abbas and what has happened sometimes with the armed resistance and the Palestinian National Authority security agencies. But that's just a concern that someone like me could have. But it's not an issue about the actual political relationship on that level. As in, of course, you have to deal with whom the legal representative is on those terms. But still, there's a lot of solidarity going on. Like I said, I mean, a lot of awareness also gives. I don't know if you've seen, but it's very easy to find footage of the mobilizations in support and defense of Palestine and now Lebanon also, almost weekly. This also tells about that socially ingrained part of the relationship, of the historic ties that I might be saying, and also how they have evolved up to this point. And on the other half, yes, you also have the exact antagonistic, the exact opposite with the kind of people who voicely support Zionism. And I'm not talking about the Jewish community, I'm talking, of course, the state of Israel and Zionism. And as we can see, there's this angle to the elections that they also had that as part of the discussions, part of the arena. If you think about Maria Corina Machado on the interview like a week before elections on I don't remember which Israeli channel, talking to a journalist and saying that when they win, they're going to move the Venezuelan embassy to Jerusalem. Has to, of course, targeting a specific audience and people who also asked for support on many levels back in 2019. I mean, a written statement, a letter to Netanyahu by Maria Corina Machado. And then you have, of course, a more covert aspect of all this. There's always, in many of these dangerous conspiracies that have been thwarted in the past, sometimes at some point, to some extent, someone talks about the Israelis in a generic way. And of course, you're talking about state security agencies. So you have also that kind of covert, not published involvement. That of course is not only something that happens on that level. It also happens on the finance world and trade world. The same hardcore lobbying, and now we're seeing something else. Before I jump into the third layer of this engagement, I mean, think about another thing. For example, back in 2004, 2005, many Chacao policemen. Chacao is a municipality that Leopoldo Lopez, also a very known figure from the opposition, from the Voluntad Popular Party, was a mayor of the municipality of Caracas, and many of the policemen of the police force were trained, like they did courses in Israel. So that kind of shapes a lot of elements of how the contrast is, but it's clearly a majority if you see who supports the Palestinian cause. Also, many people actually would be ashamed of supporting, genocide in the very specific Venezuelan context. And then you have a third recent factor, which is more to think of and to take into account, which is automatically how many of evangelical organizations have like an automatic and mathematical support for Israel. And that's not a general thing. And you can talk to many of people involved with this, with evangelics, with the evangelic practices that you can bring them into reason. They can perfectly understand. But it's like in an institutional level, it's like, I mean, I've heard this once, like, well, of course, everything, all of this is happening. And also what's happening to Venezuela has to do with Chavez damning Israel with those terms. And then, of course, I explained, so what's in Israel, what's the state of Israel. And we thought for a long time and it worked. But it shows also how it goes into a grassroots level if they're involved in this kind of religious organizations. And I'm not saying this in the general way, because I'm actually not against all of this as in what the evangelical phenomenon means in Venezuela. But of course, it's pretty coherent also to find that if you check out to which congregations and where they are organized, they're involved in at some point to the U.S., to some Christian Zionist capture of any of this evangelic thing. So this is also another phenomenon, but I think it's like more of a gray area more than an actual problem. And then finally, you have a third layer to all this, which is, I think it's even deeper, which you also have to think about. And then, of course, on the more superficial part of this, and the most on the ground, more visible level, it is you see the active solidarity of Venezuela. But on another level, in our own context, in our own way, we're dealing with the same thing, and now, which includes now the Gaza paradigm, in two senses. First of all, of course, within the framework of being denounced now and accused and smeared and demonized in a way that of course involve the same kind of semantics of the access of people and whatnot, and how easy it is for people now to say from the Israeli government in other spaces such as Spain or Mexico that something needs to be done with Venezuela. And like I said before, you have the elections proper had that dimension of the conflict. I mean, as a very blunt line between I'm almost finished, don't worry. Between the two camps, I mean, pro-Palestine and pro-Zionist in this case. But in a world when human rights are basically now lost all meaning, if you have Gaza as a backdrop of the world, as a metaphor of the world, a paradigm of the world, it's going to be pretty pathetic to be like dealing with the people who might accuse us of human rights stuff, but are the same, which throughout the whole architecture, they're actually protecting and enabling the genocide itself. And also, which is a even more dangerous thing, and it's also part of I think one of the main issues of the struggle is that, and it's also the Gaza model here, as things are becoming more acceptable for people, as in daily seeing in real time what's actually going on, and how many people, of course, are being just, I mean, outrageously murdered massively on an industrial and highly technological scale, it becomes acceptable somewhere else. It becomes now a global paradigm, and it's going to be just as tolerated now as it could be any other place in the world. So that's actually another deep layer, the final third layer of the relationship, and how existential is in a way, and the kind of threats we actually are dealing with, and how all these things intertwine of course, in this globalized, messed up, senile capitalist world. Thank you very much. I hope I also have a lot of things put on the side for more of the Q&A part. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Diego. I think it's really interesting to hear that a lot of the police forces, especially in have also been trained by Israel, not just from the US, because it's more known that US police force has been trained by Israel. And I believe there's like a database online for that. And obviously not surprising that Maria Corina Machado is also a known Zionist. I mean, I remember her basically expressing her support for Israel. So definitely not surprised there. So thank you for sharing all of that. Um,
Thank you.
so next we have, our next speaker, we have Alexander Aviña, who's a historian and associate professor of Latin American history at Arizona State University. He's written a book called Specters of Revolution, Peasant Guerrillas in the Cold War Mexico Countryside, and also wrote an article about Israel's role in Latin America in foreign exchanges called A Future of Walls or Liberation. And I highly recommend reading that article. And we'll definitely share those links after this webinar to the attendees as well. So my question to you, Alexander, is, most people are likely unaware of how deep Israel's ties are to Latin America. So can you discuss the Zionist influence in Latin America and what's happening in Palestine, how it affects politics in Latin America as well?
Yeah, thank you, Savannah, for that introduction. Thank you, Diego, for your talk. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of crossover with some of the stuff that I'll talk about. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you to Luisa for the invitation. To address your question, I'll start with some like general commentary about today, because the fact that the Latin American right is Zionist and is so openly attached to Israel, from the right wing in Venezuela to Milei in Argentina to Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro supporters in Brazil, it's no accident, right? So there's a long history that really begins in the mid to late 1960s, where you have Israel functioning as a right-wing counterinsurgent anti-indigenous power in Latin America that I'll talk about. So I'll start with some general comments about today and then work my way back to this history of Israel in Latin America. And then if I don't run out of time, I'll mention a little bit about resistance and transnational connections about resistance. So I think we live in an era of global disposability. That is an era marked by the power and the ability of states to mark entire communities and peoples as disposable surplus populations. We watch in real time as Israel commits genocide in Gaza. We have weaponized land and seascapes, along with border police and border technologies like smart fences and drones that kill migrants by the thousands. We have economic war sanctions that starve entire countries. We have more than 100,000 peoples who have been disappeared in drug wars, like the ongoing so-called drug war in Mexico. Climate change, imperial wars, and the United States' fondness for collective punishment in the form of sanctions continue to generate more and more mass refugee displacement. Global North nations have responded by betting on more apartheid walls, more border police, more surveillance. So I think a rather stark, uncomplicated choice emerges for us. Do we side with the wall builders and their apartheid counterinsurgent technology that kills refugees in places like the Sonoran Desert or the Mediterranean Sea, or those who yearn to storm and smash walls with their dreams for a more just, free future for all? The repressors, the torturers, the killers, they exchange knowledge, logics, weapons, and technology between themselves. They circulate best practices on how to manage, render disposable, and dispose of entire populations. It's a lucrative business. I write this a relatively short drive away from the 50-plus Israeli Elbit Systems built surveillance towers that guard the Arizona-Mexico border, possibly alongside Border Patrol agents that have traveled to Israel for training. This is the Palestine-Mexico border, built on top of ongoing U.S. settler colonial projects that continue to strip indigenous communities of their land and sovereignty, and maintained with technology violently developed in Gaza and the West Bank. Many within the Tohono O'odham nation did not want those Elbit towers on their land, and yet there they stand waging counterinsurgency against refugees. And that technology was developed, tested, and retested on Palestinians in occupied Palestine, before it was subsequently commodified, packaged, and sold throughout the world. For decades now, Israel has used Palestine as a workshop for settler colonialism, counterinsurgency, and all the technology that such modalities of everyday life and population control require. Now, this is a fundamental project for Israel. As Israeli anthropologist Jeff Halper has written, quote, The Israeli economy is based on exporting the occupation of Palestine. And in Latin America, past and present, Israel has made a killing as a counter-revolutionary genocidal force that has propped up death squad regimes, authoritarian governments. It is as an anti-indigenous settler colonial force with violent knowledge and tech to sell. And touching on the point that Diego made toward the end of his comments, right? I think similarly, Colombian President Gustavo Petro, I think best described the status of our current monstrous state of affairs at last year's United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP28. He linked the unwillingness of wealthy global north countries to meaningfully and structurally address capital-induced climate change, i.e. to radically change economies based on garbage production and consumption, to the management of global south populations deemed surplus and therefore disposable because they move north as a consequence of that unwillingness. So let me permit me to quote Petro at length, because I think he lays out a way to read and understand the coordinates, both repression and struggle today. Quote, the emptying of populations from the south to the north and the march of entire populations to the north is underway. The enormous social inequality regarding carbon consumption and the rising increase in carbon in the wealthy north population causes the exodus from the south to the north. There are tens of millions of people today. Tomorrow there will be hundreds of millions. What will happen with this exodus? What will happen to democracy? What will happen to international law? What will happen to humanity? I invite you all to imagine a combination of facts, the projection of the climate crisis in 5 or 10 years and the current genocide of the Palestinian people. Are these facts disconnected? Or can we look at Gaza as a mirror of the immediate future? The unleashing of genocide and barbarism on the Palestinian people is what awaits the exodus of peoples of the South unleashed by the climate crisis. This immense exodus will have a response in the North. We are already seeing it in the anti-immigration policies of rich countries and the rise of the extreme right within them. Hitler is knocking on the European and American middle classes' homes' doors, and many are letting him in. The exodus will be responded to with a lot of violence and barbarism. What we are seeing in Gaza is a rehearsal of the future. Is this future of a generalized Gaza against the growing exodus of our people avoidable? Is this future of a generalized Gaza against the growing exodus of our people avoidable? Petro, like Aimé Césaire in 1950, draws a direct link between the logic of imperialism and the rise of far-right, even fascist politics. Quote, and then one fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torture standing around the racks, invent, refine, and discuss. Israel had a relationship with the Latin American right even before there was such a thing called Israel. We have the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua that takes power in the 1930s, that by the late 1930s and early 1940s is providing weaponry to Zionist militias who are waging war not just on Palestinians, but also on British imperialists. Even when we get to the 1940s, late 1940s with the UN partition vote, it's interesting to note, and as a way to track changing attitudes in the region toward Israel, it's interesting to note that every single Latin American country voted in favor of the creation of the state of Israel, with the exception of Cuba. And in some Latin American countries, like in Guatemala, they viewed Israel as a model to follow. And we'll come back to Guatemala in terms of what actually happens there in the late 70s and early 80s when some of these Israeli policies of kibbutzes or moshavs or settlements are actually, there's an attempt to implement them as part of a counterinsurgency. So by and large, regionally, there is, as a regional bloc, Latin America is supportive of Israel up until we get into the 1960s with the 1967 war. And this is where you start to see a shift. And part of the reason why we start to see a shift is because we have revolutionary Cuba. And we have the figure of Fidel Castro and the revolutionary movement that he represents. He recognizes the PLO early on in the 1960s. He brings the PLO to the Tricontinental Conference. And by the early 1970s, I think it was after 1973 war, that Cuba cuts any sort of diplomatic ties with the state of Israel. Now, my research, I'm a historian of Mexico. So the reason how I got into thinking about the role of Israel in Cold War Latin America was when I uncovered in 1970 southern Mexico the fact that the Mexican Air Force used an Israeli airplane to dump suspected guerrillas and guerrilla supporters into the Pacific Ocean. In 1970s Mexico, Air Force pilots called it the Avocado. It was dark green with an ovoid-shaped fuselage The IAI 201 Arava airplane indeed looked like a flying avocado with wings. It was developed by Israeli aerospace industries after the 1967 Six-Day War. The first airplane developed in Israel failed to attract domestic civilian or military customers after a series of failed tests and fatal crashes. So company officials turned to the international arena and focused on Latin America, which became Israel's primary market for arms sales during the 1970s and 80s. Designed as a slow, tough, short takeoff and landing aircraft capable of transporting at least 20 passengers, the Arava found willing Latin American customers, especially those governments involved in counterinsurgent dirty war operations. I first encountered the Arava when researching guerrilla movements and state terror in the southern Mexican state of Guerrero. From an Air Force base located on the outskirts of Acapulco, military officials used the Arava to dump persons tagged as subversives into the Pacific Oceans in a series of death flights. More than 100, though the number remains fully unaccounted for. And according to legal testimony, these planes were used to transport illicit drugs from Guerrero to the north of the country. The same military technicians of dirty war, the protectors of Mexican national security, using Israeli-made airplanes had found a way to make money on the side. The Arava found its way to other Latin American theaters of state terrorism and brutality, as did other weaponry. We know now, thanks to declassified documents, that Augusto Pinochet's Chile had a long existing relationship with the Israeli military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex in Israel is really complicated because it's a web of quote-unquote private interests, but also retired military officers who turned private. And then you also in Latin America in the 70s and 80s, you have a group of really powerful private arms dealers like David Marcus Katz, who operated out of Mexico in the 1970s and 80s. So Pinochet in Chile operated a long time with Israel throughout his dictatorship from 1973 to 1990. Argentina, the military dictatorship that takes power in Argentina from 1976 to 1983, a Nazi-like, a virulently anti-Semitic military dictatorship, enjoyed military support and a commercial relationship with Israel throughout its time in power. We think that something like 30,000 Argentines were disappeared by this military dictatorship. And there's some estimates that 12% of victims were Jewish when they represented 1% of the population. If we quickly do the math, that's about 3,600 Jewish people, Argentine Jews who suffered state terrorism, right? So when we hear now about October 7th, that was the single bloodiest days for Jews since the Holocaust, the single bloodiest time for Jews after the Holocaust was actually this military dictatorship that took power in Argentina in the late 1970s and enjoyed full military support and relationship with Israel. In the early 1980s, Guatemalan journalist Victor Pereira traveled to the country of his birth to investigate what he termed Uzi diplomacy. Cut off from U.S. armaments in 1977, Guatemala received the vast majority of its armaments and military assistance from Israel well into the 1980s. It received much more than the Arava airplanes. It got its own munitions and parts factory for Galil assault rifles. It got advanced computer technology that helped it wipe out a robust urban guerrilla movement. Pereira learned that death squads and special forces responsible for murdering and disappearing thousands of Guatemalans used Uzi submachine guns. When he visited the town of Chichicastenango, he encountered community members burying a loved one killed by the military. When Pereira asked if they wanted to fight back to seek revenge, the gravedigger responded, quote, "Even if we wanted to join the guerrillas, where would we obtain arms? In church, they tell us that divine justice is on the side of the poor. But the fact of the matter is, it is the military who get the Israeli guns." In Guatemala, the importation of Israeli, quote-unquote, pacification tactics, hundreds of military advisors, and technology developed originally in occupied Palestine proved deepest and most extensive in Central America. In the midst of a, quote-unquote, quiet genocide committed against Mayan communities during the early 1980s, these scorched earth military campaigns designed with the assistance of Israeli military advisors, right-wing Guatemalans discussed the Palestinianization of the country's indigenous peoples, who comprise more than half of the country's population. Israeli advisors told the Guatemalan military officers to treat the Indians like the Palestinians, don't trust any of them, end of quote. This type of treatment led to the eradication of entire indigenous villages, the demolishing of sacred sites, and more than 600 massacres. Some of these massacres, like the one at Dos R's, where elite Caibile soldiers raped women and young girls and killed children with sledgehammers, they murdered at least 300 villagers in December 1982, and it bore the evidence of Israeli influence. A 1999 United Nations Truth Commission report, according to Anthony Lowenstein, discovered, quote, bullet fragments from firearms and pods of Galil rifles made in Israel. By 1983, the military had killed more than 100,000 Mayans and another 100,000 fled to Mexico. In a report from Guatemala in early 1983, as the military waged this genocidal campaign, then CBS News anchorman Dan Rather succinctly summarized Israel's competitive edge when it came to the arms business. Quote, Israel has helped Guatemala with no questions asked, and they didn't send down congressmen, human rights activists, or priests. They set up their own intelligence network, tried and tested on the West Bank and Gaza, simply designed to beat the guerrilla. An Israeli military advisor who was sent to Guatemala said, quote, I don't care what the Gentiles do with the arms. The main thing is that the Jews profit. Colombia also represented another extensive, long-held commercial military relationship between Latin America and Israel. Colombia in the 1980s, according to the founder of right-wing death squads, Carlos Castaños, Israel provided training for the type of right-wing death squads that were used to fight against labor union organizers, against the various different Colombian guerrilla movements, and against leftist civil society movements against a series of Colombian governments throughout the 1980s and 1990s. It was there that there's a reason why I think Hugo Chavez referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America. And this is it, this relationship that begins in 1980 to the point where now every security apparatus in Colombia has a different official Israeli rifle as their main rifle. I mean, even with Gustavo Petros's election, he's been able to undo decades of this relationship. There was a 2011 promotional video for Israeli defense and security company Global CST, as they put it, after describing a 2008 Colombian military raid into Ecuador that assassinated a senior FARC's commander. Quote, all of a sudden, the methods that proved efficient in Nablus and Hebron began speaking Spanish. Bringing it closer to my home, at a 2012 Border Technology Conference in Fair in El Paso, Texas, Israeli Defense Forces Brigadier General Roy Elkabetz told the audience, quote, we have learned lots from Gaza. It is, he continued, a real laboratory. That the US-Mexico border now looks like its counterparts in Gaza and the West Bank led journalist Jimmy Johnson in 2012 to dub it the Palestine-Mexico border. After supplying death squad regimes in the 1970s and 80s, Israel's arms industry helped create the conditions that have prompted tens of thousands of Central American refugees to flee their homelands in the past 15 years. They fled the consequences of Uzi democracy, only to encounter the Palestine-Mexico border, the site where their past and present converge. Back in Mexico, we know that the Arabas were used again in the 1990s against the Zapatista movement, both to transport elite special forces troops and for surveillance operations. I don't think these planes remain in service today. They become somewhat unnecessary. The military in Mexico has upgraded to sophisticated digital forms of surveillance, like spyware named Pegasus, made by an Israeli cyber arms company. And I'll end there because I ran out of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for all of that. That was obviously a lot to digest, but also very insightful. I would say that the thing about, Israel's technology influence is something that I'm also like reading about. I think I know you mentioned Anthony Lowenstein, and I'm actually reading his book right now. So really appreciate you sharing all of that. So we have a couple of questions that we like to ask both of you. So we're just going to start there. So, you talked a lot about Israel's major influence, especially to the right-wing forces, and also not just in Venezuela, but also in Latin America. But in terms of what's happening in Palestine, how does the war on Palestine and the hybrid war on Venezuela fit into the US's goals of imperialism? So this question is for both of y'all.
If I may, I thank you for this question because I'm so tired. I can't even understand. I forgot a key aspect of also, let's call it, common ground between with Palestina and Venezuela. I mean, we've been 10 years sanctioned. We've been economically boycotted and blockaded and tried to be to choke, try to be get choked by all this legal long arm jurisdiction of the United States, which also resembles in to some extent what also has been pre October 7 Gaza for almost as long as Venezuela, no, a bit longer actually. So that also kind of explains the crossover that Alexander was talking about on that level. I think both on different levels of intensity, Venezuela and Palestine are part of the same battlefield, part of the same landscape. Of course, there are quite obvious differences. I'm not saying it's an exact analogous situation. It isn't. Although it has very common features in the ways both populations are being punished and the ways also in which they also share what the Chinese call common destiny. In the first part, think about one more time about pre-October 7 Gaza and how the Israeli were actually committed to control each and every aspect, going through nutrition to services and whatnot, and to calculate the exact amount of calories, for example, that a person in Gaza could actually consume daily in order not to physically collapse, but stay alive, but under duress and tension and despair. And those are also on a more blanket way feature in Venezuela and how the sanctions operate and how they actually obstruct each and every channel or conduit or anything to breathe. And of course, one more time, I have to stress that there are major differences between both current situations right now, and there were already very different situations before. It's not that we have the level at the same level. Sorry for that redundancy, but so that also explains how it's also quite logical to which are the ways to resist, and in how many ways there's a common strategy, and also a big set of friends outside of the transatlantic global north, if you may. So, and because they represent on different levels, of course, I mean, you can't put at the same level the national liberation of Palestine with the national defense of Venezuela, but also it's the same worldview that operates behind this. It's also the same interest, different areas. And also both cases in different ways, one very physical and the other one more metaphorical for now, and I hope it stays that way at least, which is the need for some sort of expansion of Lebensraum in order to keep their own projects alive. Both the case of the United States regarding Venezuela and the Western Hemisphere as a whole, and Israel in both their own Zionist doctrinaire vision, but also as now the US-UK inherited foothold of the empire in the region. Also, I think that kind of gives some tips about that. And also, I would like to be the first to congratulate Alexander for also the second one, actually. Savannah, you were first. Congratulate and thank him for such an insightful work he shared with us.
Thank you, Diego. No, thank you. I think, there's, with relation to to Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza, there's been a debate, right, within U.S. foreign policy expert community, expert in quotation mark, about what drives U.S. policy in regards to Israel, right? We have the Mearsheimer thesis about the not him, the other guy. I can't remember. God, I always forget. Walt.
Walt.
The guy to talk about the Israel lobby, right? It's the Israel lobby that drives U.S. foreign policy. Yeah, Stephen Walt. It's the Israel policy that drives Israel that drives U.S. foreign policy in the region. And I think it's become quite evident that it's the U.S. that's been driving this the entire time, right? It's because, and it's using its proxy, its unsinkable aircraft carrier, as Alexander Haig referred to it in the early 1980s, as he used to refer to Israel, to advance U.S. imperial goals to reorder the Middle East. I mean, they come out and say it, right? Like, it's not like a big secret. They come out and say that was what the Abraham Accords was about, and the Biden administration. There's been a lot of continuity between the Trump foreign policy and the Biden administration policy with regards to the Middle East, with regards to Cuba, with regard to Venezuela. It's not much of a change. And I think what we've seen in this genocide that's lasted for longer than a year is you have U.S. efforts to reorder the Middle East using Israel as its proxy. Obviously, Israel has its own logic. It has its own methodologies. It has its own interests. Sometimes those interests don't align. They're not exactly, they're not 100% aligned at all time. But I just, reading that from the beginning, the U.S. Administration's position with regard to Gaza was to say the way that this is going to end is with Hamas being destroyed and being kicked out of power. Now they're saying the same thing about Lebanon and say the only way we're going to stop what's going on in Lebanon is if Hezbollah is destroyed. It's done as a political force, and we reorder what the Lebanese political structure looks like by backing the head general of the Lebanese army. It's a regime change, right? And this is a constant in U.S. foreign policy. What they're trying to do regime change in the Middle East using the genocide in Gaza, and with regard to Latin America, it's a similar dynamic. They've been trying to regime change Venezuela for more than a decade, and that hasn't. The military aspect hasn't worked, so they're attempting to starve it. Through economic warfare, right? And that's the other modality of practicing U.S. imperial policy globally, right? You have regime change, you have economic war, and then the third part of it is the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar is like a stand-in for a international financial circuitry that is wholly American, and this is one reason why you have countries, particularly in the global South, trying to find a way around this system, right? With discussions of multilateralism, with discussions as we just saw the other day with BRICS. But by and large, I see it's U.S. empire trying to do regime change. It's trying to reorder certain geopolitical arrangements of power to their benefit. Except the problem is that people on the ground in those areas tend to fight back, tend to resist, and they fight back against empire, whether it's in the form of proxies or whether it's in the form of economic sanctions. They're still going to resist.
Yeah, absolutely. There's really no way in hell in the global South that they would just let it happen to them, especially given that, especially for Cuba, even though they've been facing an embargo for quite some time now, they're still trying to find ways around, surviving, although they have a huge shortage in medical supplies as an example. And also Venezuela, a lot of it is with oil and other parts. So definitely a lot of cases where we see that resistance is inevitable. So for sure. So my next question would be, can you talk about the significance of the anti-fascist law in Venezuela and inclusion of Zionism, which includes talking about Zionism? I know that there was an anti-fascist Congress that happened pretty much right after the election. So I think 2 months after the election, it's in September. So maybe if you could share a little bit more about that and just the significance of the law itself.
Yes. Well, it has been also quite intense the way they've been organizing this. Venezuela have been dealing with these new forms of violence, which are not only physical violence, but also institutional and cultural and symbolic and psychological, especially psychological violence, that has a source, that has origins, and it has promoters and enablers. And I think it also seeks an updated definition of the nature of the resources, of the structure, the technology, and also the way it has extended in political arms, especially in, well, yeah, the West, which includes Latin America, regardless. I mean, Latin America, of course, it has a subordinate role, if you conceive it from that mindset, but it's still the West, and still the Western, pro-Western comprador elites that are translating in, well, the terms that would have been very well described recently, the means to the end, to that exact, precise, basic, candid end. So, but this also, like you've been talking about, also brings the question of how to resist and how to engage with this and how to actually gather around and build some sort of interface between many organizations and thinkers and political parties that are aware of this danger and its different expressions or chapters around the world, which includes, of course, Zionism, which it doesn't matter. I mean, you already, if you read, I don't know, at the Herzl, for example, you're already gonna understand the same rationale of that, the early fascists of the European 20th century, and how it actually has evolved, regardless of, built upon, yes, a major tragedy, a massive one, epochal changing tragedy, but abusing from it some deeper meanings, as it has been denounced many times, and being used in this way for the same, with the same kind of methodology they actually address us never again. So that kind of explains how it's well ingrained, and also brings other key aspect, which brings also technology in all its wide forms, especially as been already the case, and it's also been exposed with spyware and other ways of using advantages against what they conceive as enemies, within a very high-tech way. But this, it's also one part of the whole problem. And it has clear, even typifiable manifestations. Before the major hybrid conflicts we have, especially the two major guarimbas, which were like, the based on the Andrukhovko formula, the mix of color revolution plus unconventional warfare, which is like a general description of what the hybrid warfare is on that level. And for a long time, many of these actions, specific actions, and call to these kind of actions weren't actually properly typified. You needed a law to actually start to identify and also to, yes, to process and punish, but also to investigate these demeanors. Where do they come from? How they're being organized? And one more time, to what means, to what objectives they obey to. That's what basically it's framed under the anti-fascist law, and it's based upon experience, and it's based also on the analysis of reality itself. In the electoral juncture, many of these manifestations were actually quite clear and even more transparent in what they actually meant. And think about the connection between organized crime, Maria Corina Machado, and Elon Musk on the same level. Rooting for themselves in the same team and cooperating on different scales of this. Think about Milei's Uber Zionism and his logistical, political, and diplomatic engagement and clout for some of these operators in Venezuela, and how they also make the best of the past gray areas to actually, well, do very things that are basically criminal. I mean, if you kill people, if you're willing to kill people, if you're willing to wound people, regardless of how you frame it on some narrative, that's still a crime, isn't it? And also in some cases, maybe they don't, of course, they're not going to inherit it directly, any of the classic early 20th century fascism means of representation. It's more a social regime like Boaventura Sosa de Santos said, not a political regime, but a social one. And which also brings something that it also brings this question, because mostly these people always support their own current thing, regardless of what that is. And now it's, of course, Israel. It was something else before. And but it comes from actually the liberal matrix, the liberal womb, if you think in that way. I mean, everything stems from this. All these major massacres we're hearing from, we're knowing from, we're seeing, we're witnessing are actually done mostly in the context of liberal governments. When you have more an extreme version of this, it's just the intensification of the same lines, and also a more direct, sometimes clumsy, sometimes just gangster-like forms of doing this, of executing these ideas. I think that's the only main difference when you put in this context. And regarding outside of the United States, the relationship of how we can see Trump and, for example, Trump administration from a democratic one, and how actually the framework and the legal things and the clout, it's actually more, and the indirect approach, as in not stating the small letters out loud, kind of tells you it's the same basis. It just changed forms. And you need to find also the proper ways to organize with this and to be effective, at least if not in defeating it outside of your own neighborhood, at least to be able to do it in your own neighborhood, and also be able to defend not only your own land, but also everywhere around. It's a common cause. The basic lines is the same. And of course, when in crisis, it takes this now polyphacetic, fascistic kind of shape.
No, I mean, I don't really have much to add. I was just thinking that, for decades, we think about U.S. empire in their so-called backyard. Or no, I guess Biden upgraded Latin America to the front yard. So I think about the destabilization efforts that the U.S. engaged in Chile during Allende's tenure, right? And that, in a way, has become an like the longest lasting MO of regime change or internal meddling that the U.S. empire does in Latin America, right? And fascism is one of the domestic forms of fascism, or domestic forms of extreme right-wing political movements, becomes a tool for both domestic political concerns, but like in Chile in the early 1970s, it turns out that they're always somehow linked to the U.S. national security apparatus, right? So we know that throughout the 3 years that Allende was in power, even before he took power, you had far-right fascistic movements, Patria y Libertad, that were influenced by like the Francoism. They're already setting off bombs, right, to destabilize Chile, even before Allende had taken office after winning the elections in the fall of 1970. The whole purpose is to use fascism as a way to create internal political, social, and economic instability, to then lead to creating what Kissinger and others referred to as a coup climate. you're trying to create the conditions for a coup. You're trying to create the internal conditions for some sort of regime change that's not coming from the U.S., but it's going to happen from within. And as we saw with Chile in the early 1970s, it was the Chilean military setting aside more than a century or so of respecting the Chilean constitution and putting into power a horrific military dictatorship. Um, so it's just I think about the historical manifestations of that, right? Of U.S. empire, different security apparatuses within the U.S. state that makes common cause or is able to create alliances or negotiations with domestic far right groups within different Latin American countries to help to stabilize what they identify as enemy regime. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how that regime, that government regime, using their language, comes to power. What matters is that they're antithetical to U.S. geopolitical designs for the region, and it's more effective if the U.S. can kind of mess around covertly by aligning itself with far-right, fascistic, domestic expressions of power. Let them do the dirty work. Diego brought up the example of organized crime. Organized crime fulfills a similar function. It fulfilled a similar function in Colombia in the 80s and 90s. To a certain extent, it's fulfilled a similar political function, although manifested a little differently in Mexico. But that becomes another, organized crime also can become a vehicle for which to kind of smuggle in U.S. empire into these countries.
Um, well, I think we are pretty much out of time right now, so I really appreciate both Diego and Alexander for joining us, shared these really insightful analyses about Israel's influence, not just in Latin America, but also how Venezuela is showing their solidarity with Palestine. We'll definitely continue these conversations in the IC as well. So we'll be pretty much share all of the different resources and links for each of these folks' work, as well as some of the books that were also mentioned in this webinar. There was a question about if there's a list of the books that we mentioned. So we'll be sharing that too. So I just wanted to, before we wrap up, do a little bit of a plug. So, and then we'll just have like final comments for both Alexander and Diego. So we, the Venezuelan working group is pretty much going to be continuing to do work around Venezuela solidarity. So if you're interested in getting involved, I know Tristan or DSA IC, aka DSA IC, had posted a link to the chat to join us. So definitely fill out that interest form if you're interested. And yeah, I think other than that, we maybe if both of y'all can share like some final brief comments.
Well, I think there's no small moment, small event regarding these issues, these subjects, be it where I live in or be it Gaza or other similar topics about the dangers of, well, the times we live in now. And how valuable it is just to get one person to get more interest, think about it, and do something on any level about these issues. It's always a fundamental element that actually has more value now than before. So I'm really thankful. I mean, so keep that in mind when you do this kind of thing. It is important. It is important regardless of, well, of the many logical limitations you might have from any point of view, including well, us, the speakers in this case, in my case. So basically, it was like I'd just like to thank you all because coming over and engaging in throwing out some questions and just listening to us about these things. And I hope it's also useful to or to find the rationale in a template that also operates. I mean, think about how all of these things also have been manifesting themselves in the way they try to control and to attack the very own populations with the same resources, methods, and approach to this. So hopefully it doesn't get that close, but I mean, that's how not so far we are from even yourselves at the core, like you like to say, at an imperio. And the many things you have also, the many challenges, social problems that you also have to deal with, and how it's by design that all of this is happening. And we already know the reasons. So thank you very much. I would like to thank the DSA Venezuela Working Group and my friend David Paul in particular, which is like happy to see him quite often here in Venezuela. And many of you already, I hope many more of you also do, and to, well, learn and find out and make your own conclusions about what's going on in Venezuela, regardless of what the final outcome is. So thank you very much. I also would like to thank Alexander for sharing this panel and giving such insightful views. So muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you to DSA International Committee for inviting me. This was great. Thank you to Diego for a conversation, for allowing me to like bounce ideas off of him and off of you, Savannah. In terms of final comments, I mean, you know, it's election season in the US, so I feel like we should start like a hashtag SOS USA using that bullshit. But because I do feel it's like terrible time here in the entrails of the belly of the beast. But there's a Mexican anthropologist who has a quote who says, "En este mundo cabrón, el que no resiste no existe." So it's kind of like the rough translation, like in this terrible world, those who don't resist don't exist. And I try to remember that every morning when I wake up and I read or I watch something horrible that's happening in this ongoing genocide in Gaza that seemingly has become normalized. And now when 100 people die in northern Gaza, it's just like it doesn't even get on the front page, doesn't get news. It's not even discussed. So the distance between Gaza and us is not far. It's moral, it's political, it's ethical, and just thank you for organizing these type of events because there is an urgency right now that we really have to do everything in our powers within the core of this empire to stop this horrific genocide that is spreading to places like Lebanon. So any way in our small little way that we can contribute to at least consciousness raising. And at this point, I'm just thinking anything helps. But the way to stop this is through a variety of different forms of resistance that we need to continue to think through. But thank you all.
Thank you all, both Diego and Alexander, again for joining us, sharing all these wonderful insights. Really an honor to be in this panel with you all. And definitely, if you're interested, like I said, to join the Venezuela Working Group, you can fill out that interest form in the chat. But otherwise, thank you. We'll see you all in the next webinar or whichever other event that we'll be putting together. Thank you all.